Welcome to another Job Talks Access. I'm with Manmit Pandori. He's a director in capital markets at Bank of Montreal. Thanks for joining us, Manmit. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Great. So if you could start off just by letting us know what you do, what your job is, and kind of some of the responsibilities.
Yeah, for sure. So I work on the repo and asset management team within global markets at Bank of Montreal. Kind of the main function of my job day to day is helping kind of manage the balance sheet and the funding for the trading floor at BMO, as well as on the asset management side. We come up with a variety of different trading and investment strategies with mainly focused within the fixed income space. I know that probably sounds like a lot of like bank related words, but it really kind of comes down to coordinating different groups' capacity and letting or helping making sure that other groups are kind of managing their balance sheet accordingly and things like that. And then on the investment side, it's really coming up with creative ways to put on fixed income trades that are going to kind of help the bank make money.
Mm-hmm. And would you say there's a part of your job you enjoy the most?
Yeah, I think that every day is different. And so that's probably something that I enjoy the most. I have to, keep pretty engaged with the news, with the markets. And that's like a big passion of mine. And so it's nice to kind of come in and there's always something different that's going on. And so that keeps it interesting. It keeps you on your feet. It keeps you engaged all the time. And I think, I feel like that's probably one of the things that I like the most about the job, for sure.
Yeah. And as far as your career path, can you talk a little bit about how you got to where you are? Is this a goal you had from the beginning, or what was sort of the decision process to end up in your position?
Yeah, so when I was in high school and stuff like that, I didn't really know what I like most people. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and then I decided to go to business school when I graduated from high school. I did an undergrad there, and kind of like end up getting like steered in these different directions of like what exactly you want to do within finance. I was lucky enough to go into a kind of like an internship process at another bank, and it was very helpful for me to kind of get a lay of the land of like what there is to do at a bank and all these different areas and groups. So I think it kind of like cast a pretty wide net to start on kind of just wanting to be in finance in general. And then over the years that I've been working, I think you kind of I gradually kind of like honed in on the specific areas or the specific functions and things that I actually liked. So that's kind of like how I got started. But I've always I followed a pretty traditional path of going to business school, and I did my CFA after that, staying within like the finance field, and then like jumping around. I worked at a couple of different places. But I think over time you kind of like gradually get to know what exactly you want to do. When I started, it was, you have like no idea what you want to do, right? Like I think people sometimes fool themselves by saying, yeah, when you're 20 years old or something, like, oh, this is exactly what I want to do. But until you get experience in it, it's kind of hard to know. So similar was, I guess, kind of naive when I started, and then you kind of gradually get closer and closer and you find out what you like. And so I think that's kind of like how it's just happened over the years.
For sure. Yeah, that's great insight. And would you say throughout the process, in your opinion, was there opportunities for advancement throughout, or did you have to shift around a lot to figure out, how to move up and get to where you wanted to go?
Yeah, I think you can, like, if you're, it's a lot sometimes it's very circumstantial. Like it depends on the situation. You might have an opportunity to, because somebody senior left their job, or there's an opportunity to take on a challenge, and you put your hand up for it, and that gets you like this path of moving up quicker than you otherwise would. I think for me, it was much more taking risks of, I had a pretty stable job at another bank, and then I decided to leave to go work at a very small pension fund at the time. And so, that was like a big risk, but I knew it was going to teach me the skills that were more relevant to the stuff that I wanted to do down the road. But I think, understanding those risks are really important, and taking them is important as well. And I haven't. Sometimes it might take you jumping around, and what you'll notice is, I think, once you get into some part of your career where you're pretty stable and it's what you want to do, the people around you might be from totally different backgrounds. You might work with, like, I work with some people who've jumped around to 10 different firms before, and then there's some people who've worked at BMO for 25 years, and they've just been there their whole lives. So but they're both in the same spot. So I think it kind of like depends on what works best for you. But I think it kind of comes down to the situation, circumstances, and just an openness to take those risks when they come up.
For sure. Yeah. And when it comes to, as you said, taking the risks and moving around, I'm wondering, when it comes to the job search, what do you have any thoughts on that as far as accessibility, like getting interviewed, hired, or onboarding, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so maybe a couple of things on the job search side. I think, nowadays there's so many great candidates out there, and there's so many great people and educated people, and a lot of the degrees or education you might do tends to end up being like table stakes for a lot of these things. Like, you kind of have to have those just to even get looked at. So I think what you can really do is really try to stand out by just doing more, showing your passion for different things, whether it's like extracurriculars, things like that. And then outside of that, I think it's really important to just network and meet with a lot of people, as many as you really can, because I think that helps one kind of shape what you actually want to do. And it's really helpful as like somebody even in my position, when we talk to interns or rotationals and our junior people in our team, it's great when they have an idea of like, hey, this is what I might be interested in, and they've done their research and all those things. So I think the more you network, the more you start to understand like what in a practical sense is going on in the workplace for that specific field. And then in terms of accessibility and things like that, I think it's important to be true to yourself, and actually understand these are the accommodations or whatever it might be to set yourself up to be successful. Like, ultimately, I don't think you want to put yourself in a position where you're I think people sometimes feel pressure to hide things or deal with things on their own and things like that. Like, I think that if you're almost setting yourself up to not be successful when you do that. And I think being more open and sometimes it can feel uncomfortable to do that, because we're probably not used to it. And even for myself, like at the beginning, I felt really uncomfortable with my wheelchair and everything like that. Like, it you can sometimes feel like very you kind of stand out from those things. But I think for any employer, and I know that for BMO and for basically anybody in Canada, like they want to give you an opportunity to be successful. And so just voicing those needs or requirements that you might need is the best thing to do for yourself ultimately.
Right. So if you could build a little bit more on that, not necessarily just the job search and hiring, but just as far as barriers in general, is there anything you would say about uh, navigating the workplace and struggles you've had to overcome to get to where you are?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the organizations in Canada and the workplace in general has progressed so much over the last 10 years, 20 years, whatever you want to call it, that I've been fortunate enough where I haven't ever felt like uncomfortable or not being able to have access to, if I need accommodation or whatever it might be. And I think over time that will shift. There's such a big focus on diversity, and rightfully so, there should be, at all of the big organizations. And I think over time that will start to normalize, people having the ability to ask for things that they need. And I think ultimately the culture of the where you're working is really important, so that you don't feel uncomfortable when you ask for stuff or whatever it might be. Like I think even for myself, like I've worked for a lot of great managers where I've always felt like, yeah, if I need something for my wheelchair or whatever, yeah, they're always ready and willing to help where they can. And I think similar now, there's been a big shift where, whether it's visible disabilities like I would have, or invisible things, invisible disabilities, people have the opportunity to ask for those, and ultimately they'll be hopefully given those chances to kind of have that stuff, and also be successful in the end. So I haven't come across like very many barriers, I would say. I think the biggest thing I've just tried to focus on is being as open and communicating whenever I have needed those in the past.
Yeah, for sure. I would say, like you said, being comfortable is a big thing, and being able to
Yeah,
be open, and the more, as you say, more focus is put on it, then I feel like the more comfortable people will be,
for
and
sure.
more willing to put themselves out there to get into these kind of positions.
Yeah, 100%. Like I think that as you start to feel more, I guess, I guess there's like, as you start to feel more normal in a situation, the more comfortable you feel. And I think that there's a big effort in our society and in organizations and employment, all these things, to have everyone feel as comfortable and as normal as they can feel. And that's ultimately going to lead to them being successful. And so I do feel that kind of shift happening. Um, and hopefully it continues to progress in that direction.
Absolutely. And so in that same sort of vein, I'm wondering from your perspective, what do you think the next big step or the greatest positive change will be as far as accessibility in the workplace moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a tough question, I guess. I don't know if there's a specific thing. I think that, for me, the more you see people with disabilities, or if you're a minority, if that's another thing, or women, all of these different diverse groups, I think that as you see those people progress in an organization, and ascend to more senior positions, or to more executive branches of an organization, I think all of those things just help provide, whether it's motivation or just ability to have that goal, and have the aspiration that you could be one of those people one day. I think for a long time, especially within at least my mind, and I would think probably for a lot of people in like the disability community, it's hard to imagine where you can go, because you're kind of trying to just like look just what's ahead of you. And I think that for in the next phase of progression and things like that, is you see other people with disabilities, or people that are similar to you, whatever it might be, kind of get higher and higher up in organizations, all these things. And you can have that motivation of like, I can be that person one day. And so I think that's kind of like the next phase of bringing success to people who need accessibility and things like that. And that will ultimately lead to, the next generation or people who are, still in school or whatever, wherever they might be, to just kind of like have those ability to think that those goals are not unachievable.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I like what you said.
Yeah.
As far as, sometimes with certain disabilities, it's, you're almost focused on today and like the
Yeah,
short term, and it's
for
hard
sure.
to look forward, but having representation and seeing other people
Yeah,
in senior positions is
yeah,
definitely giving, others something to shoot for.
for sure. 100%.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, man. We really thankful for your insights, your thoughts, and helping us try to make a difference with the Job Talks Access Project.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for having me, Paul. And yeah, if I can ever come back or chat with you again, I'm happy to do it. It's been a great time.
Definitely. That was Behmet Pandori. I am Paul Vanderbrent, and this has been Job Talks Access.